Welcome, engineers. My name is Travis IQ, and today we're talking IPv6, my top 4 IPv6 myths of 2021. Let's go. Boy, is this going to be fun. We have a number of myths out there, and I think we should start debunking them right now. My number 4 IPv6 myth is that ICMP v6 and DHCP v6 are the same as their ICMP and DHCP v6 DHCP counterparts. This is not true. ICMP v6 and DHCP v6 work very differently. Despite the fact that they have the exact same abbreviation with just a v6 amended, these are protocols that you want to know more thoroughly in v6 than you would in v4 in their v4 equivalent, specifically ICMP v6. ICMP v6 has a lot more functionality than we typically associate with ICMP. You normally think of ICMP v4 as things like ping and TTL exceed and redirect messages. And then you would say, well, Travis, if I blocked ICMP in my network, I could actually probably reduce some traffic and potentially increase security without allowing some of these hosts to get enumerated via ping and things like this. And you could. If you blocked ICMP v6 in your network, as opposed to ICMP v4, you would have a lot more problems. ICMP v6 is used for a neighbor discovery protocol, and it's used for a lot of functionality in the neighbor discovery protocol, neighbor advertisements, neighbor solicitations, router solicitations. It's used for duplicate address detection, all these other things. So you want ICMP v6 running in your network. You potentially could block ICMP v4. You can't do that with ICMP v6. DHCP v6. DHCP v6 is significantly different from its v4 counterpart. We know the v4 dynamic host configuration protocol to go through the DORA operation procedure when doling out addresses in a stateful configuration. We don't have stateless in v4, but I'll say stateful anyways because that's what it is. In DHCP v6, so this is v4, in v6 we actually proceed through a different mechanism. And this is not a course discussing dynamic host configuration, so we're not going to go into too much depth, but one, the way that they proceed is different. Two, something like DHCP v4 will dole out default gateways. DHCP v6 will not dole out default gateways. The default gateway is determined through a different mechanism in v6. Furthermore, DHCP v6 can be used in conjunction with stateless auto configuration, so you can use Slack with v6, or you can use Slack alone, and you don't need DHCP v6 at all. So that's a very different host configuration methodology in the v6 infrastructure than in the v4 infrastructure. So our first myth, debunked. ICMP and DHCP are not the same or even particularly similar in v4 and v6. Myth number 3. Myth number 3 is a very interesting one. The myth is there is no fragmentation in IPv6. This is an interesting myth because it may be one that you have come across or one that you haven't come across. But this is a myth. There is, in fact, fragmentation in IPv6. So then why would someone say that there is no fragmentation in IPv6? That is because routers don't fragment in IPv6. No router fragmentation in IPv6. This has led to the subsequent myth that there is no fragmentation in IPv6, and this is untrue. There actually is fragmentation in IPv6. There's a whole extension header associated with fragmentation in IPv6. It's called the fragmentation extension header. Then why has this myth come about, right? Well, first, there's no fragmentation. There's no router fragmentation in IPv6. So then where do we fragment? We fragment at the host. At the host. What happens if a packet enters the router with an MTU larger than the maximum MTU on that link? The router sends an ICMP v6. There you go. There's your ICMP v6 message of packet too big back to the host. and the host adds the fragmentation header and all the associated information with fragmentation. Again, not a fragmentation course, but that is why we have the myth of no fragmentation in IPv6 and how we debunked it here at our number 3 myth in IPv6. Number 2, coming in at number 2 on our top 4 IPv6 myths, is that IPv6 networks are less secure because we don't use NAT. No NAT equals less secure in IPv6. I've heard this myth before. I will probably hear it again. This is a myth, right? First and foremost, you can do address translation in V6 if you wanted, but you don't need to because the address space is so large that there is no requirement for address translation. You could use all global unicast addresses in your network. Intuitively, I think that as network engineers or network people, we think, whoa, that doesn't seem more secure. It seems less secure, right? But realistically, there is actually no difference in security when you're obfuscating internal IDs or internal IP addresses. If you think about it in terms of what is the security principle? What security tenant does NAT fulfill? If we think about it, really what it does, if we're not talking about address filtration or any of these other things, we're talking about NAT in an IPv4 environment, what it does is it utilizes security through obscurity, basically. Obscurity. Because we translate those addresses and you can't see my internal addresses, although they exist, and without some other address filtration technique, they are still communicatable via either port numbers or however you translated those addresses. And if you've taken a security course or if you've heard security through obscurity as a term, you know that we use this term to say that this is not a security tenant. Burying your head in the sand and saying, I hope that people can't figure out my internal network. I hope that people aren't looking for me. I hope that my devices aren't enumerated is not a security tenant. And so if NAT is not a security tenant, then not utilizing NAT is not going to make you any more or less secure. It doesn't hurt you in any way, right? Traffic filtration, filtering end-to-end connectivity, utilizing end-to-end connectivity to monitor networks, and these things are actual security tenants. And so if you think about maintaining end-to-end IP addressing in a V6 environment, it might actually be more secure in terms of network management and network and analyzing packets. But that's for a different day. I also think that it is weird that network address translation was originally a gap mechanism, right, to allow you to get to IPv6. So IPv4, we're running out of addresses. We decide to translate our internal networks to a smaller subset of public IPs so that we can abate this issue of running out of public v4 addresses so that we can get to IPv6. And now NAT is being used as an argument for IPv4, even though it was really just a transition mechanism to IPv6 anyways. That's neither here nor there. It's just an interesting point. That was number 2 on our list of my top 4 IPv6 myths. What's number 1 then, Travis? What is number 1 on your list? And number 1 on my list is that IPv6 is more secure than IPv4. This is a myth, and I'll tell you why I think this myth has come about. I believe that this myth has come about because this fact is actually true. IPsec, the IP Secure Protocol Suite, is built in to IPv6. And as such, some individuals would say, well, that's more secure than IPv4. This is not true. It is allowed, and there is an extension header that builds the functionality in to be identified, but it is not required to use IPsec. If you use IPv6 in its default configuration and IPv4 in its default configuration, the two protocols are pretty equivalent. The V6 header is a little bit more streamlined. The V4 header is a little bulky and has some reserve bits and yada yada they did back in the 80s and late 80s that we don't do anymore, right? But from a fundamental standpoint, v4 and v6 are layer 3 protocols that define source and destination information and allow us to transmit data globally. So IPv6 is not more secure than IPv4 natively. This is, I think, equivalent to the statement that you hear sometimes that cloud is more secure than on-premises. And then you hear all of these nightmare stories about cloud implementations because people thought of it as more secure, but realistically, cloud and on-prem is only secure as the implementations that you use to secure them. Firewalling, defense in depth, network monitoring, all of these things you have to do on-prem and off-prem. I'm getting off topic. IPv6 is not more secure than IPv4, and that is my number one v6 myth of 2021. As is always the case, engineer, break stuff, and have fun. If you like the video, like and subscribe for more content. We're going to keep pumping out networking, security, and all-around tech videos. We'll see you next time.